English.
Hey there. I heard you're interested in the differences between American and British English. As an American, I'd love to chat about it.
Absolutely. As a Brit, I'm always fascinated by how our shared language can differ. Shall we compare some words?
Sounds great. Let's start with something simple.
American English versus British English.
In the US, we live in apartments.
Ah, yes. Here in the UK, we'd call that a flat.
Interesting. And when we need to move our stuff, we'd use a truck.
We'd call that a lorry. Much more fun to say, don't you think?
Ha, I don't know about that. But speaking of transport, when we need to go up in a tall building, we take the elevator.
We'd hop in the lift. Same function, different name.
And to fuel our cars, we fill them up with gasoline, or just gas for short.
Petrol for us. I've always found it amusing that Americans call a liquid gas.
Fair point. When we're driving, we might take the freeway to get somewhere fast.
We'd be on the motorway. Though I must say, freeway sounds much more liberating.
True, but if we want to avoid traffic, we might take the subway instead.
Ah, we'd call that the underground. Though in London, it's often referred to as the tube.
Interesting. And when we're walking, we stick to the sidewalk.
We stroll along the pavement. Much more poetic, I'd say.
Maybe so. Now, let's talk cars. The front covering of the engine? We call that the hood.
For us, that's the bonnet. Like a hat for your car.
Cute. And the space in the back for luggage? That's the trunk.
We call that the boot. No idea why, to be honest.
Funny how these things develop. Oh, and when we need to cross over a road, we might use an overpass.
We'd call that a flyover. Sounds a bit more dramatic, doesn't it?
It does. Now every car needs a license plate.
Which we'd call a number plate. Quite literal, that one.
True. Now let's move away from cars. When we need to throw something away, we use a trash can.
We'd toss it in the bin. Short and sweet.
And when we need water, we turn on the faucet.
We'd turn on the tap. Sounds a bit like the noise it makes, doesn't it?
It does. Now, if we need light in the dark, we use a flashlight.
We'd reach for a torch. Though that might conjure up images of fire for you.
Definitely. Moving to the bedroom, we store our clothes in a closet.
We'd put them in a wardrobe. Sounds a bit more fancy, I think.
It does have a nice ring to it. Now, if it's cold, we might put on a sweater.
We'd don a jumper. No connection to jumping, unfortunately.
That's too bad. For babies, we push them around in a stroller.
We'd use a pram, short for perambulator, though I doubt many people know that.
Wow, that's quite the word. Now, outside the house, we might relax in the yard.
We'd enjoy our garden, even if it's just a small patch of grass.
Interesting. If we're having a snack, we might eat a cookie.
We'd nibble on a biscuit, though I believe what you call biscuits are more like our scones.
That's right. On a hot day, we might enjoy a popsicle.
We'd cool down with an ice lolly. Quite descriptive, that.
It is. Now, with our burgers, we often have French fries.
We'd have chips with ours. But your chips are our crisps.
That's right. It can get confusing. Speaking of snacks, we might have some candy.
We'd indulge in sweets. A bit more general, perhaps.
True. Now, in cooking, we might use eggplant in a recipe.
We'd use aubergine. Sounds a bit more exotic, doesn't it?
It does. And what about that long green vegetable? We call it zucchini.
That would be a courgette for us. Another French-sounding one.
Interesting. And that herb with the distinctive taste? We call it cilantro.
We know it as coriander. Same plant, different names for the leaves.
Exactly. Now, when making burgers, we'd use ground beef.
We'd ask for minced beef. Essentially the same thing.
Right. And those colorful peppers? We call them bell peppers.
We know them as capsicums, though peppers is also common.
Interesting. Now, moving away from food, when applying for a job, we'd submit a resume.
We'd send in our CV, short for curriculum vitae.
Got it. In school, we study math.
We'd study maths. We like to keep it plural.
Interesting. And the head of a school? We call them the principal.
We'd refer to them as the head teacher. Quite descriptive, that.
It is. Now, if we make a mistake, we might use an eraser to fix it.
We'd reach for a rubber. Though I know that means something quite different in American English.
Oh yes, that could lead to some awkward misunderstandings. Now, after high school, we might go to college.
We'd say we're going to university. College, for us, usually refers to a specific type of secondary education.
Interesting. And when we get our results, we receive grades.
We'd receive marks, though grades is becoming more common here too.
And our mailing addresses include a zip code.
We'd have a postcode. Does the same job, different name.
Exactly. Now, at university, we might study in a specific faculty.
We'd call that a department. Faculty, for us, usually refers to the teaching staff.
Interesting distinction. And when school's out for summer, we call it a school vacation.
We'd say it's the school holidays. A bit more festive, perhaps.
It does sound more fun. And a portion of the academic year. We call that a semester.
We'd call it a term. Shorter word, same meaning.
Got it. Now, when we go shopping, we might use a shopping cart.
We'd push a trolley. No relation to the San Francisco ones, I'm afraid.
Ha! Now, let's talk clothes. What we call pants, you call...
Trousers. Your pants are our underpants.
Right. And for exercise, we might wear sneakers.
We'd put on our trainers. Because they're for training, I suppose.
Makes sense. Now, a woman might carry a purse.
She'd carry a handbag. Purse, for us, is just for money.
Interesting. Now, at a restaurant, when we're done, we ask for the check.
We'd ask for the bill. Same idea, different word.
And if we need cash, we might go to an ATM.
We'd visit a cash point. Though ATM is becoming more common.
Interesting. Now, when we buy something, we might pay sales tax.
We'd pay VAT, value-added tax. A bit more specific.
It is. Now, if we need medicine, we might go to the drugstore.
We'd pop into the chemist. Sounds a bit more scientific, doesn't it?
It does. Now, to carry our money, we use a wallet.
We might call it a billfold, especially for the larger ones.
Interesting. Now, let's talk sports. What we call soccer.
Is football for us. Your football is our American football.
Right. And we might go see a movie.
We'd watch a film. Though movie is becoming more common here too.
And we'd see it at a theater.
We'd go to the theater. We spell it differently too.
Interesting. Now, when we take time off work, we call it a vacation.
We'd go on holiday. Sounds a bit more relaxing, I think.
It does. Now, in sports before a game, we might have practice.
We'd call it training. More serious sounding, perhaps.
Maybe so. And the event itself, we'd call it a game.
We'd call it a match. Unless it's a friendly game, of course.
Right. And if neither team wins, we call it a tie.
We'd call it a draw. Like drawing even, I suppose.
Interesting. Now, where the game is played, we might call it a field.
We'd call it a pitch. No relation to pitching in baseball, though.
Got it. And the person in charge of the game? We call them a referee.
We might call them an umpire, depending on the sport.
Interesting. Now, moving away from sports, if we need to fix something, we might use a wrench.
We'd reach for a spanner. No idea where that name comes from.
Funny how these things develop. Now, to make a call, we might use a cell phone.
We'd use a mobile phone. Or just mobile for short.
And to charge it, we'd plug it into a power outlet.
We'd plug it into a socket. Sounds a bit more snug, doesn't it?
It does. Now, for babies, we use diapers.
We'd use nappies. Short for napkins, I believe.
Interesting. And in our kitchens, we might have a garbage disposal.
We'd call that a waste disposal unit. Bit of a mouthful, that one.
It is. Now, where we park our cars, we call it a parking lot.
We'd use a car park. Nice and simple.
It is. And to send a letter, we'd use a mailbox.
We'd pop it in a postbox. Does the same job.
Exactly. Now, on a car, the front window is called a windshield.
We'd call that a windscreen. Screens the wind, quite literally.
Very literal. Now, at a restaurant, we might say, Can I get the check?
We'd ask, can I have the bill? Slightly more polite, perhaps.
Maybe so. Now, if we don't want to eat at the restaurant, we might get takeout.
We'd order a takeaway. Same idea, slightly different phrasing.
Interesting. And where we buy gas for our cars, we call it a gas station.
We'd fill up at a petrol station. Does the same job.
Exactly. Now, for minor injuries, we might use a Band-Aid.
We'd reach for a plaster, though Band-Aid is known as a brand here too.
Interesting. Now, the season after summer, we call it fall.
We call it autumn. A bit more poetic, perhaps?
It does sound nice. Now, in a building, what we call the first floor.
Would be our ground floor. Our first floor is your second floor.
That can be confusing. Now, if we're waiting in a line,
We'd be queuing. We love a good queue in Britain.
ha! Now, if we need legal help, we might call an attorney.
We'd consult a barrister or solicitor, depending on the type of legal work.
Interesting distinction. Now, if someone breaks the law, they might go to jail.
They'd be sent to prison. Though we do use jail in some contexts.
Got it. And the people who enforce the law? We call that law enforcement.
We'd refer to the police force. A bit more specific, perhaps.
It is. Now, if we're buying a house, we'd talk about real estate.
We'd discuss property. Covers the same things, essentially.
True. And on a divided road, the area in the middle, we call that a median.
We'd call that the central reservation. Bit of a mouthful, that one.
It is. Now, an elected official in our legislature, we'd call them a congressman or congresswoman.
We'd refer to them as an MP Member of Parliament.
Interesting. And a legal professional? We'd call them a lawyer.
We'd usually say solicitor, unless they're a barrister.
Right. You mentioned that distinction earlier. Now, when we choose our government, we have an election.
We'd have a general election. Sounds a bit more comprehensive, doesn't it?
It does. Now, for babies, to stop them crying, we might give them a pacifier.
We'd offer them a dummy. No relation to intelligence, I assure you.
Ha! And to transport them, we might use a baby carriage.
We'd push them in a pram, short for perambulator, as I mentioned earlier.
Right. Now, a place for pedestrians to safely cross the road, we call that a zebra crossing.
We use the same term, though we might also call it a pedestrian crossing.
Nice to have some common ground. Now, in a car, the pedal that makes it go faster, we call that the gas pedal.
We'd call that the accelerator. More descriptive of its function, perhaps.
True. And the part of the car above the wheels, we call that the fender.
We'd call that the wing. No relation to flying, unfortunately.
Interesting. Now, for camping or traveling, we might use a trailer.
We'd hitch up a caravan. Sounds a bit more adventurous, doesn't it?
It does. And a larger vehicle for traveling and living, we call that an RV recreational vehicle.
We'd call that a camper van. Again, sounds a bit more fun.
It does. Now, where roads meet, we call that an intersection.
We'd call it a junction. Does the same job, different name.
Exactly. And a major road with multiple lanes, we might call that a highway.
We'd refer to that as a dual carriageway. Bit of a mouthful, that one.
It is. In America, we call that fluffy, sugary treat at carnivals cotton candy.
Oh, you mean candy floss. That's what we call it in Britain. It's the same delightful sugar cloud, just a different name.
Interesting. How about that wiggly dessert? We call it Jell-O in the States.
Ah, we simply call that jelly. Though, I should mention, what you call jelly, we call jam. It can get a bit confusing.
No kidding. Speaking of confusing, when nature calls, Americans typically ask for the bathroom or restroom in public places.
We'd be more likely to ask for the toilet, or loo. It's much more direct, isn't it?
I suppose so. Now, in our homes, we store clothes in a closet.
We'd call that a cupboard. Though we use cupboard for storing other things as well, not just clothes.
Got it. How about in cooking? We use corn in many dishes.
We often refer to that as maize, especially in agricultural contexts, though corn is used too.
Interesting. Now, here's a time-related one. If I say see you in 2 weeks, what would be the British equivalent?
We might say, see you in a fortnight. It's a bit old-fashioned but still commonly used.
Fortnight. I like that. Now, let's talk punctuation. At the end of a sentence, we use a period.
We call that a full stop. Same function, different name.
And when we're excited, we use an exclamation point.
We'd call that an exclamation mark. Same level of excitement though.
Now, when we want to add extra information in writing, we use parentheses, like this.
We call those brackets. And what you call brackets, we refer to as square brackets.
This is getting interesting. In the kitchen, we bake cookies on a cookie sheet.
We'd use a baking tray for that. Though we'd be baking biscuits, not cookies.
Right. I forgot about the cookie biscuit difference. Now, what do you call the utensils we eat with?
We call those cutlery. I believe you use the term silverware, even when it's not actually silver.
Exactly. And the person who brings us our food in a restaurant, we call a waiter or waitress.
We're moving towards using the gender-neutral term server, though waiter and waitress are still common.
That's similar to the US. Now, after the main course, we might order dessert.
We often call that the pudding, even if it's not actually a pudding.
Fascinating. Let's move to sports. In soccer, or should I say football?
Definitely football here.
Right, in football, players wear soccer cleats in the US.
We call those football boots. Much more straightforward, I'd say.
Fair enough. Now, let's talk clothing. What we call underwear, you call.
We call those pants, which I know can be confusing because you use pants to mean trousers.
Exactly. And what we call a vest in America.
That would be a waistcoat for us. Your vest is what we'd call a singlet or sleeveless shirt.
Interesting. How about overalls?
We call those dungarees. Though I think overalls is becoming more common here too.
And a raincoat?
We'd typically call that a waterproof, though raincoat is used as well.
Makes sense. Now, a turtleneck sweater?
We call that a polo neck. Same cozy, high-necked design.
And when we're lounging at home, we might wear a bathrobe.
We'd call that a dressing gown. Robe, for us, usually refers to a more formal gown.
Interesting. Now, let's talk about waste. We throw things in the trash.
We'd call that rubbish. And we'd put it in the bin, not a trash can.
And garbage is another word we use for that.
We'd be more likely to say waste for that. Taking out the waste rather than taking out the garbage.
Got it. Now, the person who cleans up in a school or office, we call a janitor.
We'd call that person a caretaker. They take care of the building, you see.
That makes sense. Now, in rural areas, we might live on a ranch.
We'd simply call that a farm, regardless of what's being raised there.
Interesting. And a trailer park?
We'd call that a caravan park. Caravans being what you'd call trailers or mobile homes.
Now, in cooking, we use cornstarch to thicken sauces.
We call that corn flour. Not to be confused with cornmeal, which is different.
Right. And the case we put over a pillow is called a pillowcase.
We sometimes call that a pillow slip, though pillowcase is used too.
Now, for shopping, we go to a shopping mall.
We'd call that a shopping center. Though, mall is becoming more common here too.
Interesting. And when something turns to the left, we say it moves counterclockwise.
We say anti-clockwise. Bit more direct, I suppose.
And the curtains that hang on our windows, we sometimes call drapes.
We just stick with curtains for those. Drape sounds very fancy to British ears.
Now, a large building with many residences, we call an apartment building.
We'd call that a block of flats. An individual apartment we'd call a flat.
And the person who helps you buy or sell a home, we call a real estate agent.
That would be an estate agent for us. The real is implied, I suppose.
Makes sense. Now, where do you store your cookies? I mean, biscuits?
In a biscuit tin, of course. I'm guessing you'd call it a cookie jar?
Exactly. And that clingy plastic wrap we use in the kitchen?
We call that cling film. I believe you call it saran wrap, after a brand name.
Right. And a paper towel for cleaning up spills?
We'd call that a kitchen roll. Same idea, different name.
Now, that foam material used for packaging, we call styrofoam.
We'd call that polystyrene. Styrofoam is a brand name that's not used as commonly here.
Interesting. And a candy bar?
That would be a chocolate bar for us, even if it's not entirely chocolate.
Now, back to sports. The field where football is played?
We call that a football pitch. I believe you say soccer field.
Exactly. And those straps that hold up pants? Trousers?
We call those braces. I know, suspenders means something quite different in British English.
Oh, I can imagine. Now, when we travel, we might use a car rental service.
We'd say car hire. We hire cars. We don't rent them.
Interesting. And a motorcycle?
We often call that a motorbike, though motorcycle is used too.
Now, here's a personal one. We call our female parent mom.
We spell it mum. Same pronunciation, different spelling.
And a paper currency, we call a bill.
We call that a note. A £5 note, a £10 note, and so on.
Now, where we go to see a doctor, we call it a doctor's office.
We'd call that a doctor's surgery, even though most routine visits don't involve actual surgery.
Interesting. And the first year of school for young children we call kindergarten.
We call that reception or early years. Kindergarten isn't really used in the UK.
Now, that game with X's and O's we call tic-tac-toe.
We call that noughts and crosses. Much more descriptive, I'd say.
And the fastener on clothing we call a zipper.
We just call that a zip. Simpler, isn't it?
It is. Now, the person who delivers our mail we call a mailman.
We call that person a postman, or more commonly now, a postal worker.
And those things that clear rain from our car windshield?
First, we'd call it a windscreen, not a windshield. And those would be windscreen wipers.
Got it. Now, when we're ill and can't work, we might take sick leave.
We'd more commonly call that sick pay, referring to the money you get while off sick.
Interesting. In banking, we have a checking account for everyday transactions.
We call that a current account. Same function, different name.
And a savings account for putting money aside?
We might call that a deposit account, though savings account is used too.
Now, the police who patrol our major roads, we call the highway patrol.
We'd call them the motorway police. Motorways being what you call highways or freeways.
And finally, what we wear to bed we call pajamas.
We spell that pajamas. Same pronunciation, just a different spelling. This has been absolutely fascinating. It's amazing how many differences there are.
I know, right? It's like we're speaking the same language, but with so many little twists and turns.
Indeed, it just goes to show how language evolves differently even between countries with such close ties.
Absolutely. I wonder how many misunderstandings these differences have caused over the years.
Oh, I'm sure there have been plenty, especially with words that mean something completely different in each version of English.
True. like how pants means underwear in British English, but outer trousers in American English. That could lead to some awkward situations.
Exactly. Or imagine an American asking for a rubber in a British office, meaning an eraser, while in British English, it has a very different connotation.
Oh wow, I hadn't even thought of that one. It's really important to be aware of these differences when traveling or communicating internationally.
Absolutely. It's part of what makes language so fascinating, though. These little quirks and differences tell us so much about our shared history and how our cultures have diverged over time.
That's so true. It's like each word carries a little bit of cultural history with it.
Precisely. And it's not just the words themselves, but how we use them, the idioms we create, and even our sentence structures that can differ.
You're right. I've noticed that British English often seems more formal to American ears, especially in writing.
Yes. And American English can sometimes sound overly casual or direct to British ears. It's all about the cultural context we're used to.
This conversation has really opened my eyes to how complex language can be. It's not just about vocabulary, but about entire systems of communication.
Absolutely. And it's ever evolving too. I wonder what new differences will emerge in the coming years, especially with the influence of internet culture and global communication.
That's a great point. The internet is probably both bringing our versions of English closer together in some ways and creating new divergences in others.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of linguistic evolution. Who knows what American and British English will sound like in another 100 years?
It's exciting to think about. Maybe we'll end up with a new global English that combines elements from all over the world.
That's an intriguing possibility. In the meantime, I suppose we'll just have to keep comparing notes and enjoying the richness of our shared language in all its varieties.
Couldn't agree more. This has been such an enlightening conversation.
Indeed it has. It's been a pleasure exploring these linguistic nuances with you. Thank you for watching.
If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.
Stay tuned for more exciting English lessons. See you in the next video. Keep learning and keep improving with LK English.